Greetings from Tokyo. This is Daisuke Beppu, and I hope all of you are doing very well today. Again, I'd like to beg your pardon, but if you don't mind, I'd like to show you some more of 5 by CRITERION. So this is another installment of 5 by CRITERION. I'd like to say from the outset that I received a really nice comment and suggestion from a viewer who asked that I talk a little bit about the technical specifications as well as some of the supplementary material that may be found on the titles that I'm about to discuss. I think that's a really valid point, and I will try to do so going forward. Although I'd like to just point out that I think from my point of view, I think the most important thing is the film itself. Although I do appreciate that the supplementary material and the technical quality and the visual, video and audio quality aspects are very important. So I will try to respect that in the way that I am able to. So without further ado, let us begin in earnest. Please enjoy. Spy number 433. Yukio Mishima's Patriotism. This is a very short film from Japan, only about 27 minutes, and this is from 1966. This is based off of the work Patriotism, which is a short story or a novella written by Mishima himself. Yes, that was first published in 1961, I believe, and it dramatizes certain events that took place in 1936 with respect to a failed coup d'etat amongst certain ranks of the officer class of the Japanese military. So we have basically a story about an officer who's played by Mishima himself, which is another fascinating aspect of this film, who must basically do some pretty interesting things with respect to the carrying out of what he considers to be his duty and the following of a certain code of honor. And also, it's his dealings with his wife and how they are dealing with this need by this officer to fulfill what he believes to be this code of honor that he follows. And so therefore that's it. That's the story within the 27-minute time frame. It is a silent film in the sense that there is no spoken dialogue, and there is a musical track that is over the image. The images of these two characters interacting, and we do have title cards which help give explanatory background to the story. Very helpful. And then we see the two characters, the husband and the wife, the officer and his devoted wife, trying to deal with this situation. And they deal with it in a very interesting and quite dramatic and quite shocking way, actually. And that's the story. This movie is quite fascinating for a number of reasons. First, not least of which being, first of all, that the film is made by Mishima himself So it's made by the author of the work upon which it is based. So you have a real interesting maybe sort of artistic phenomenon that's going on here with respect to an artist trying to redepict a work of art or work of literature that he created in a different medium. So that's a very interesting facet, first of all, on a very, how should I put it, maybe filmmaking technical level. The other fascinating aspect of this film is that this is a film that was, again, it was made in 1966, and there were certain events that occurred in the life of Mishima in 1970. And this is a part of historical record. It's a fact that Yukio Mishima died in 1970 under very, how shall I put it, unique and unusual circumstances. I don't want to explain too much, but if anyone is interested and doesn't know about the life and death of the real life author, Yukio Mishima, I highly encourage you to look up some of the background information, maybe online or through books, because it is a real interesting, to say the least, it's a very interesting set of facts that occurred with respect to this very famous author, Yukio Mishima. With that information about his life and his death, this film becomes quite an interesting document, because it is made only, 4 years prior to his death, 1966 versus 1970. And one might get a sense of certain maybe eerily depicted parallels that occur between this work of art and what eventually happens to Yukio Mishima, the man, in 1970. Very interesting. Yes. Again, if you know the background of Mishima and you know what happens to him, it's quite overwhelming to watch this film. It's quite disturbing in many respects, actually, which is what I think makes it quite a compelling watch. And the filmmaking itself, I should add that the filmmaking itself in this film is actually quite interesting. I think, if I were to put it in general terms, I would say that you have on the one hand the story, which is this very intimate portrayal of this couple who obviously love each other very much and are devoted to one another. And you have the close-ups of their faces, you have shots of them in very intimate situations, and you have other shots of them in very, very, how should I put it, graphic depictions. And so all of this paints a portrait of a very intimate and very loving and close couple. So you have a very strong sense of connection with this couple on a very emotional level. Irrespective of the politics of the couple themselves. On the other hand, you have this very theatrically shot production. In other words, everything feels like a set. It feels very removed from reality, and it feels very artificial, which is an interesting dichotomy if you think about it. On the one hand, you have something that's very intimate and close and emotionally rich, or potentially so. On the other hand, you have it set against a backdrop that's very fake and very theatrical, and creates this interesting tension, which I think serves the drama even more so, and it also serves as a kind of nice counterpoint to Mishima himself, who is a man, as you might know, filled with many seemingly irreconcilable contradictions. Very fascinating, this film is. It's a short film and it's a DVD, so perhaps it might not be an attractive choice as a candidate of purchase to those of you who are only interested in Blu-rays, but I strongly suggest that you take a look at this film if you are able to, because it is, as I said, if anything, a fascinating historical document into sort of the mind of a man who would end up doing some very unusual yet significant things only 4 years later. Yukio Mishima. A quick word about this release. So this is a new restored digital transfer of the Japanese version and the English version. There is also a 49-minute audio recording of Mishima at the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. There is also, that's a very interesting supplement, by the way, very interesting. There's also a 50-minute making of documentary, which is also a very interesting documentary, I might add. There is also clips or excerpts of interviews of Mishima discussing World War II and death. And finally, there's a book with a essay written by the great Tony Raines. It's a wonderful essay. And there are also some notes on production. And also there is a book. The book also includes the original short story of Patriotism, which I think is fantastic, because I believe that reading the short story or the novella of Patriotism is really important and fundamental to the understanding of and appreciation of this film. So if you are to watch this film, I highly recommend that you read Patriotism as well, to help supplement your to help supplement an appreciation of this film. It's really interesting, fascinating watch, and on that score alone, it is highly recommended. So Yukio Mishima's Patriotism, Spy Number 433 DVD. Spy Number 521, Mystery Train. This is from 1989 and from the United States, directed by Jim Jarmusch. Yes, this is a very interesting film. Well, I said it was from the United States, but I should correct myself slightly. This is also, I understand, subject of funding from Japan, or from entities in Japan. So therefore, in that sense, it might be a co-Japanese-American production, I suppose, which is interesting considering what the nature of the stories that are included in this film is. So Mystery Train is a collection of 3 stories, each centered around or connected with the city of Memphis. A very famous city in terms of the history of rock and roll and in terms of the history of rockabilly, not least of which being due to the fact that the famous Sun Studios is located here. It has a very close connection with the great Elvis Presley. So you have this whole great atmosphere of an old city, a historically relevant city in terms of culture, in terms of American culture, in terms of musical culture and the evolution of popular music style. Incredibly important city Memphis is. So you have that as the backdrop, as the overarching theme, as the overarching structure of a film that includes 3 stories, each of which is connected with Memphis and with music and the importance of both. And you have these stories of these characters, each of which involves characters that is not an American, which is an interesting choice. So the first story involves 2 Japanese young persons, a couple, a boyfriend, they're probably boyfriend and girlfriend, you get a sense, coming to Memphis for the first time. And then you have the second story about an Italian woman who is transporting the body of her husband and she finds herself having to go through Memphis and stop over at Memphis, right, or stay in Memphis. And then the third story, you have an Englishman who is caught up, or who initiates perhaps a certain set of circumstances that involve himself and a couple of his friends in Memphis during this night. And all these three stories take place over the course of the same temporal plane, or the same night, and the same set of events. So you have the same time frame, but basically three separate stories that occur generally within that same time frame. So you have this little nice interplay between time shifts and singular events that occur as constants among each of the three stories. So you see how each character reacts to those constants, which is an interesting little interplay. It has that freshness about it. And at the same time, though, what I love about this film so much is that it never overstays its welcome in that sense. And then what I mean by that is, on the one hand, it seems like it's a very clever screenplay written by a man who is very clever in trying to tie up the stories with certain key events that occur. Maybe the same radio program is played at the same exact time and plays the same exact song, and so each of the characters in each of the stories is shown listening to that same program, etc. So that is a very interesting way to tie the stories together, and it's a very clever way. But at the same time, I think Jarmusch is very good because he doesn't brag, he doesn't overstay his welcome, he doesn't show off his cleverness. He instead gives the characters room to breathe and grow. And what I mean by that is that he lets his camera linger on the characters doing simple things. They are talking about simple things, about real things. They stop, they breathe, they drink, they sit down, and then they talk again. They walk across the shot. They walk down a sidewalk. You hear their footsteps. You see them look. You see them talk again, interact. And it's wonderful because you realize that the dialogue is important, yes, but just as important as the dialogue is the space in between the lines of dialogue. And those spaces are occupied by looks, by glances, by movements, by walks, by maybe gestures of character. And the list goes on. And it's really great because the screenplay is clever and I think also quite ingenious in some places. But Jarmusch does not rest on his laurels. He instead gives his characters time to breathe and live and be fully fleshed out, and ask questions that are seemingly simple and naive, but the more you think about it, the more you realize that some of them are quite profound, actually. Yes, so this is all to say that that kind of structure and respect that Jarmusch gives lends itself more to the overarching aspect of coolness of the film, if that makes any sense. And on that note, this is an extremely respectful and very cool film. Very cool, which is why I love it so much. Oh yes, and one last thing. If you don't like rock and roll music, from the 50s, American rock and roll, and if you don't like rockabilly, by the time you finish watching this film, you will love rockabilly. Believe me. It's a great genre or subgenre of American rock and roll, really important. I remember actually when I was in college, I actually took a trip to Memphis. It was I wasn't with any girlfriend, unfortunately. I was more by myself, but it was still a very important journey for me because I was really in love, and still am, in love with rockabilly music. And I remember going to Sun Studios, much like the Japanese couple do in the first story, Far from Yokohama, and it was such a magical time. It's a simple place, not a very excuse me. It's a simple place, not a very it's a very small place, basically a room, but it's a magical place to go when you realize the history and the lore and the importance of the place. It's living, breathing history. Anyway, so that's just a little aside about Mystery Train. This release, by the way, is according to this is a new restored high definition transfer, digital transfer, approved by Jarmusch himself, with uncompressed monaural soundtrack. There is also a Q&A with Jarmusch, which is a real cool Q&A. He's so mellow and nonchalant, and yet he gives these nuggets of really cool information about the film, about his views on Elvis, about his interest in literature and photography and poetry. Really interesting, just fascinating man, Jarmusch. And the Q&A is such, it epitomizes his character and his intelligence so perfectly. There's also an excerpt from a documentary about Screaming Jay Hawkins, I Put a Spell on Me, which is really great because Screaming Jay Hawkins is in this film and he plays such a pivotal character, a lovely character, a funny character, and just a brilliant depiction and performance by Screaming Jay Hawkins. And so the excerpt of the documentary about him is really great because we hear stories by Jarmusch and also stories by Screaming Jay Hawkins himself. And they sometimes are consistent, but sometimes they are not consistent with each other. And it's really interesting to see the way their stories differ sometimes. There's also an original documentary focusing on the setting of Memphis itself, which is a pretty interesting document, I think. There's also on-set photos by a photographer and also behind-the-scenes photos. And there's also a really nice booklet of essays. Really nice. So anyway, this is 521, Mystery Train by Jim Jarmusch. Spy number 691, Thief, 1981. This is a film directed by an American director named Michael Mann. This is I guess what one might call an action thriller on the one hand, but on the other hand, it is so much more than that. It is quite a profoundly moving film, and it is profoundly moving because its characters are so raw and rugged and believable, and so one roots for them in a way that's quite stunning, I must say. The core performance is, of course, James Caan. James Caan as the titular thief. He basically is a professional thief. He breaks into safes and steals what's inside the safes, and he's really good at it. And so the story is he is hired by a certain boss, a gang boss, or a certain man of criminal influence, or influence in the criminal underworld, and thus begins a story of a man who's trying to control his life, a man who's trying to find a better destiny for himself and some focus in his life, a man who tries to find love and stability, and basically how it is all just shot to hell, and how this man tries to deal with it. And boy, does he deal with it in a way that is explosive and dynamite, and at once heroic and also tragic and extremely memorable. Yes, Thief is a masterpiece of a film. As I mentioned, James Caan leads the way, but you also have Tuesday Weld, who is fantastic as the love interest. Just the chemistry between Tuesday Weld and James Caan is, it just can't be beat. There's a really great scene between the two of them early on in the film, where they're just talking in a diner, and it's just so wonderful just to see the rhythms and the heartbeats, the way that one character is so hesitant and resistant, and the other character is so resigned to that character's life. And you find that these characters are, I say this with great affection, they are losers. They have, for whatever reason, have had a hard life, and they find each other, and they're trying to connect with each other in the simple setting of a diner, and it is so sweet and moving and heartbreaking and enthralling. And that's just a great example of how this film is moved by its characters to the nth degree. It's fantastic the way it does that. And to top it all off, you've got these wonderfully exciting set pieces of action, of suspense, of intense violence in many places, in fact, but all with a purpose, and all with a sense of drive and a sense of focus, and all leading towards a wonderful climax. And it is a fantastic climax. I won't say anything more, except to say this: the music that is played over that climax, those last, I guess, 5 minutes of the film, that music is so cool and so exhilarating. Yes. If and when I die, I leave this world, I shuffle off this mortal coil, as it were. If I do die, I want that piece of music to be played at my funeral. It's just the coolest piece of music. Thief, James Caan, Tuesday Weld, but also you've got these great performances. Willie Nelson is fantastic. Who'd have thought about that? You've got James Belushi, of course. He is fantastic in this film. And then you have Robert Prosky. Oh man, what a great villain he plays in this. Just electric and charming, and so dangerous, and so villainous. He's wonderful. Wonderful. Thief, yes, Michael Mann. You have this happens to be the dual format edition, so it has the Blu-ray and the DVD. Although I'm not sure, maybe now you have just single releases, just a Blu-ray or DVD. I'm not sure. So, but in any event, it's still readily available. This also has a great commentary by Michael Mann, joined by James Caan. And you also have interviews with many of the key players of this film, and a trailer, plus a booklet with a great essay. This is a fantastic film, a fantastic action film. It's a fantastic thriller. It's a fantastic suspense film, a heist film in a certain sense. But ultimately, it is a great character study film, led with just full ferocity and vigor by the great James Caan. Thief by Michael Mann, 1981. Spy number 745, Don't Look Now, which is a film from 1973, directed by a gentleman whose name is Nicholas Roeg. This quite possibly is one of, if not the most disturbing narrative fiction film that I have seen. And that is because, well, there are many reasons for that. It is quite a disturbing film. It's quite a violent film, and it is quite an intense film. So immediately, those should be warning bells for any of you who are not into intense films. You should probably stay away from this film if you don't like scary films, because this is quite a scary film. But it is a disturbing film, and I mean that very complimentarily. It is a very disturbing film because it is a film ultimately about loss and the depiction of loss. And from my point of view, it's the most heartbreaking loss of all. A couple's the death of a daughter, which occurs very early on, and it's how the couple tries to deal with this idea of grief and guilt and loss over the death of their young daughter. Amidst that, of course, you have this very almost regal-like setting in Venice, which is at once beautiful and terrifying at the same time. It's terrifying because you have these foggy streets that are suddenly bereft of any human life other than the echo of footsteps of some phantom or some figure unknown, but someone who is this key to this mystery that is occupying the minds of this couple, played by Donald Sutherland and Julie Christie, but especially Donald Sutherland as the film progresses. This is a dynamite of a film. It, as I say, chilling, frightening, disturbing, and just a marvel. Again, it's this idea of being unnerved because you realize that something horrible has happened from the outset, from the very beginning. You have the establishing of the premise, which is the death of the daughter. And from this is born certain events. And these events are both narrative in content and style, but also these events are very thematic and very influential in terms of mood. So on the one hand, you have narrative events, and on the other hand, you have sort of mood or stylistic events. And what do I mean by that? Well, on the one hand, the narrative is basically a kind of a mystery. You have a couple in Venice trying to deal with loss and grief, and there are certain narrative events that occur that lead to a mystery of perhaps the daughter is trying to talk to them from beyond the grave, and from that comes forth a mystery element combined with other aspects of the film, which turn into maybe a kind of a murder mystery, kind of thriller. Very fascinating and frightening. That's the narrative aspect. And then on the sort of thematic or stylistic or mood aspect, you have these real just wonderfully eerie ways in which the film is edited. It goes back and forth in time in certain respects. It goes abruptly from one set of characters to another set of characters, and quite abruptly and quite without context. So the fact that you have edits that occur with suddenness and abruptness and without context is in itself quite jarring, and as a result can be quite terrifying. Suddenly you have basically maybe a couple talking, and then suddenly you cut to, for example, two old ladies that are just laughing. You don't know if they're laughing because they're just having a good time, or they're laughing like they're like the witches from Shakespeare's Macbeth or something. I don't. It's quite unnerving, and this is just a very simple technique, but it's very effective. It's not like a great load of special effects are being employed here. On the contrary, very simple filmic techniques like editing, silence, sound, lighting, and music are all combined to perform this great service of creating tension and horror. A real fascinating example of this, just fascinating. I don't want to say anything more about the plot, because that is one of the great delights and surprises of this film, is the plot, the narrative plot, and how the mood and the eeriness kind of envelop the plot in a way that is so enticing and mysterious, and then at the same time it just grabs you and doesn't let go, and then it is relentless. Boy, some scenes, some shots will just never leave you. They will never leave me, that's for sure. They've just made almost a permanent, indelible impression upon my mind. And there is also a great tenderness and just a brave sense when I'm talking about the depiction of this couple played by Donald Sutherland and Julie Christie. They are not afraid to show you the weaknesses of these characters. They are not afraid to show you these characters at their most vulnerable, and they are not afraid to show you these characters at their most intimate and real. And I find that to be very refreshing and honest, and just so worthy. I think. I think it just really. I respect that so much. Yes, I respect the performances here by Donald Sutherland and Julie Christie just so immensely. There's a very famous scene of the couple. It happens early on, but it's a very famous scene, or infamous, depending on who you are, of the couple being shown making love. And it's considered to be quite a very risque scene, in that there is a lot of maybe sort of very intimate and very how should I put it? Very intimate portrayal of a couple having sex, and it's a very real and it's a very honest portrayal of that, and it's so moving, because remember, this is a couple that's lost a daughter, and so you have this couple trying to connect in a way that is both intimate and is trying to recharge the relationship, but also amidst this setting of grief and sorrow and loss and guilt, which is very complex and very challenging to depict, and yet it's so it's such a lovely moment, because it is so human and frail and delicate, and yet so complex and so respectful of the human condition and the way that human beings can be both simple and honest and pure, and yet so complex and quite nuanced at the same time. It's just, it's wonderful. It's a true work of art, an example of a work of art in a film that is so rewarding and so complex as it is. A horror film and a tender story about a couple just trying to deal with loss. Don't Look Now. It is just a full package of a film. It's just fantastic on its terms, and it just lingers in the mind, and it will never, it probably will never leave you. It certainly hasn't left me, but again, it is a very intense and violent film, and a very scary film. So with that in mind, if you don't like scary films, stay away from this. If you do like scary films, watch it, but please, I urge you to not read about it. Don't listen to any reviews. Don't read about the plot synopsis. Just go in as blindly as possible. You will be so rewarded, I promise you. This is the Criterion release Blu-ray with the 4K digital restoration with uncompressed monaural soundtrack, and also approved by director Nicholas Roeg himself. Then there's also a conversation between editor Graham Clifford and the film writer and historian Bobby Osteen. Next you have a documentary called Don't Look Now, Looking Back, which is a very good documentary, by the way. Next you have a wonderful piece called Death in Venice, which is an interview by the musician Pino Donaggio, who wrote the music for this film. It's a real wonderful score, by the way. And Pino Donaggio is a famous musician and a creator of film scores. Next you have a something interesting, a new piece on the writing and making of the film, with interviews with Julie Christie and Donald Sutherland, among others, which is also a really great supplement, I should say. Next you have a little supplement about Nicholas Roeg, the director himself, which is fascinating. Nicholas Roeg is a very fascinating director on many levels. This is perhaps, one of his most famous films, among many famous films that he has made, by the way. Then you have a Q&A with Roeg himself. That was from 2003. And finally you have a trailer, and then you have an essay included in the book, by David Thompson, which is a fine essay. Anyway, Don't Look Now, a modern horror classic. Spy number 927, El Sur, from 1983, directed by Victor Erice. This is a film from Spain, and it is a marvel of a film about a relationship between a father and daughter, or to put it more accurately, perhaps, a story about a daughter and the way that she grows up from a young child to a young woman, and along the way seeing the way in which she views her father grow and develop and change in a way that is both endearing and lovely, and also sometimes quite sad and incredibly moving. This film is a masterpiece, and I would even go so far to say that it is perhaps a masterpiece among masterpieces. I am not a scholar or student of Spanish history. I do know a little bit, not so much, but I know a little bit about the Spanish Civil War, but I do not claim to be an expert at all. That being said, I think that a general understanding of the Spanish Civil War and its impact upon Spanish politics and culture is quite important and key in enabling one to get a better appreciation of this film and how that works, and how this film works as a sort of metaphor or allegory for the kind of the split, the Civil War split, and this idea of the film and North and South, and the split between certain characters within the same family structure unit. It's really, it's the full package here. So, so that suggestion is, I make that with, I make that with love and respect. So if you are so inclined to watch this film for the first time, I highly suggest that you just take a moment. It doesn't have to be a quick, it doesn't have to be you don't have to get a book, and you don't have to take a course, although that would be better perhaps, but it can be just very cursory viewing online about information about the Spanish Civil War. But even with that, vital information. I think at the core of this film is what I mentioned, is this relationship, the way in which the daughter views her father, and the way in which the father is both a figure of stability in this family, but also a figure of mystery and instability in this family. The father, Augustine, is one of those unforgettable characters, indelible, profound, very moving, at once so knowable and yet at the same time so elusive, which is what makes the relationship between him and his daughter Estrella just so intriguing and compelling. And I don't like to bring in my personal feelings usually when I do these videos, but I am a father, and I am a father of a young daughter now, who is, at the time of this video, who is 6 years old. And seeing this film from that perspective was really, I wasn't quite prepared for the emotional impact that this film would have on me, but it had quite an impact indeed. As I say, this is a masterpiece among masterpieces, and the interesting thing about this film is its production history. I'm sorry, before I go into that, let me just say one more thing about the film in substance. Every moment of every shot, of every sequence, of every movement, and of every scene of this film is important and filled with meaning and significance and deliberate, just deliberate relevance and power and poetic beauty. And that's all due to the greatness of Erice's vision and direction. And in that sense, it really operates almost like a silent film, and it really goes towards that fundamental relationship that a viewer has with the film that he or she watches. It's ultimately the image that we see on the screen that triggers some kind of emotional or intellectual response in us, that creates this feeling that we have when we watch a film. And El Sur is perhaps one of those prime examples of a film where every image creates that reaction or impulse, which is both astounding and just awe-inspiring, perhaps. Yes, El Sur is a miracle and a masterpiece among masterpieces. Now, this release by Criterion is a 2K digital restoration with uncompressed monaural soundtrack. It also includes a 2003 interview with Erice himself, the director. And this is very important because he talks about the production history, and he talks about how the production was halted about halfway through, or maybe a little bit more, because the official story being that funding was no longer given to the film. And as a result, he was unable to film certain key sequences that were planned to be filmed in the South. This is taking place in the North, but there were also sequences that were to take place in the South. But those sequences were never filmed. So we have the film that is set basically in the North, where the South is discussed, but we never visit it. The film, as it stands now, I think is a masterpiece. It is profoundly moving. It is a masterpiece. But to hear Erice speak so kind of sadly about the loss that he suffered as a result of not being able to make the film about the South, or the sequences about the South, is so one of those, great tragedies in film production history, I would say. But at the same time, it is almost affirming in a way to see him speak so vividly about what could have been, about those sequences that he had planned to shoot in the South and the characters he had planned to give us had he been able to shoot those sequences in the South. It is such a key thing, without giving away spoilers, it is such a key thing for the relationship between Estrella and her father, this idea of visiting the South and seeing what the South would have in store, because the father is from the South and he is such a mysterious figure, and it is by way of going to the South that we can hope to understand more about his character, and Estrella can hope to understand more about his character. So the fact that the South scenes were never shot and thus were never included in the final film is just one of those great what-if questions in cinematic history. What if those scenes had been shot and included in the final film? We have a masterpiece now, but if those scenes had been included, what would we have been graced with? Perhaps just, oh gosh, I can't even, it's impossible for me to fathom what kind of emotional impact that would have had on me. Yes. Anyway, so that is just an aspect. That is a prime aspect of this film, and that is discussed by Erise with great grace and modesty. He is a real gentleman about it, and it's a real privilege to hear him speak in this interview. There is also a great documentary that is from 2012, which assembles other interviews from other key players of the film, and included in which is a great discussion about the production history of the film, which differs quite dramatically from how Erise explains it. And ultimately, what is true or not true, I'm not sure, but ultimately it makes Erise look all the more, of a gentleman, and I know I don't want to say more except to say that this documentary is fantastic. Then you have a wonderful television show from Spanish television, which assembles 3 film critics led by a moderator, and they talk at length and with great love and respect about this film in a way that is in the context of Spanish cinema and also world cinema, and it is a fantastic program. I highly recommend watching this supplement. Then there is an essay in the booklet, but also included, which is fantastic, is the novella by Adelaida Garcia Morales, which the novella provides the story which forms the basis of the film El Sur. And thus it is quote-unquote the complete story, so you get the whole story, which includes the components from the South, which were unfortunately not included in this final film. So perhaps reading that novella is very key in order to get a sense of what could have been with respect to this film. But again, this film is a masterpiece now and forever in this version. But reading the novella and knowing the production history, even just on a general scale, is also quite vital and important for an appreciation of this film, El Sur. It is a masterpiece. Please watch it. Please. It is... if I could describe it, it might be like... I don't know, like watching it it's like a masterpiece among masterpieces, yes, but I guess more crucial is that it's almost like it's just fundamental to loving cinema. This film is fundamental to loving cinema, so on that basis alone, you owe it to yourself to watch this film if you haven't already. El Sur by Victor Erise, 1983. Spine number 927. Thank you very much. That concludes this episode of 5 by Criterion. I hope you found some of this to be interesting. If you decide to watch any of these films, please let me know. I'd be so happy to hear your comments and reactions. They can be positive reactions, they can be not so positive reactions. Either way is perfectly fine by me. I'd love to hear what you have to think. Please leave a comment. Please feel free to try to contact me in Facebook by private message or otherwise, and let's continue these great conversations about these great films from the Criterion Collection. Thank you very much, and have a great rest of your day. Cheers.